This video is on factoring out a common factor. When you were in the younger grades, you learned that multiplication and division are opposite operations. Well, the same is true for distributing and factoring. So just as you can distribute a number like this, distributing is when you multiply and you get 3x plus 6. Factoring is the opposite. Factoring is when you start out with the 3x plus 6 and you're asked to factor out a common factor. So what does 3 and 6 have in common? What can they both be divided by? So in that case it would be 3. And then what would you have to distribute? What would be on the inside in order to get this for an answer? So you'd have x plus 2. 3 times x is 3x. 3 times 2 is 6. So it's sort of like starting with the answer and working backwards. And that's called factoring out a common factor. What do these two terms have in common? And you factor that out. And you could factor out a common number. You can factor out a common letter. Let's look at that. You could look something like that. You could have xy plus x squared. And if you were asked to factor out a common factor, you'd say, what do both terms have in common? They both have an x in them. So you could factor out an x, and you'd get y plus x, because x times y is xy, and x times x is x squared. So factoring is the opposite of distributing. We already know how to distribute, now we're working backwards. Let's look at some other examples. You could have, so in this example, you could have a number that you factor out. Here you could have a letter, or you could have both. In the example of 8x times 6x plus 1. If you were to distribute, you'd get 6 times 8 is 48x squared. And then 8x times 1 is 8x. And again, that's distributing, right? We draw these arrows. And if you're working backwards, you'd say, what can I divide both 8 and 48 by? And you'd say, okay, they both have divisible by 8. This has an x, this has two x's, so they have at least one x in common. And then 8 times 6 times 8 is 48. X times x is x squared. And plus, what can I multiply 8x by to get 8x? It's 1. So that's working backwards. So this is distributing, this is factoring out a common factor. There are other types of factoring which we're going to talk about later on, but for now this is what we're doing. Okay, and then let's look at a little bit more difficult example. 32x to the 4th minus 40x to the 3rd plus 56x to the 2nd. If you were asked to factor out a common factor, what do all of these terms have in common? Oops, this was a 40. That would be 8, because 8 goes into 32, 8 goes into 40, and 8 goes into 56. So I can factor in 8 out of all of these. This has 4 x's, this has 3 x's, this has 2 x's. So the most that they all have is 2. So we're trying to take out the most that they all have in common. 4 times 8 is 32. So 4x squared, because x squared times x squared is x to the 4th. 8 times 5 is 40. And you put 1x here, because 1x times 2x is x to the 3rd. Plus 7 times 8 is 56. And I don't need an x, because 7 times 8x squared is 56x squared. So, and you can always, you shouldn't really get these wrong, because you can check your answer by distributing. So after you're done factoring out a common factor, just distribute and make sure you get back where you started. It's possible to not factor out enough. In this case, if I had factored out a 4, because 4 goes into each of these, it still would have gotten a decent answer, but it wouldn't have been completely factored. It's sort of like asked to reduce 4/8, and you say 2/4. You're not wrong, but you can reduce it more and you get a half. So had I factored out a 4 instead of an 8, I would have got a correct answer. It just wouldn't have been factored completely, just like this is not reduced completely. Okay, so that's factoring out a common factor. Once again, sometimes you're only factoring out a number, sometimes you're factoring out a letter, and sometimes you're factoring out a letter and a number. Maybe maybe one more so I can show that you can factor out two letters. You could have like x squared y plus y squared x plus xy. And so each of those terms has an x and a y. So this is an example of factoring two letters out. And in order to get this term, I need an x, because x times x would make the x squared, and the y is already there. Plus x times, here I would need a y, because xy times y would be xy squared, plus 1, xy times 1. So you can check this again. If you distribute, you would end up back where you started. So distributing and factoring are opposites of each other, and this is called factoring out a common factor.